In the 1990s, we lived in a remote village in Quebec, Canada. The nearest house to ours was 3 kilometers away, belonging to our neighbors. Back then, I was 6, and my siblings were 4 and 2 years old. On a cold winter night, we were huddled together, fast asleep. Then we were awakened by sounds coming from downstairs. It was a man's voice, speaking to himself in a language we couldn't understand. My dad told us to stay quiet and went downstairs with his rifle. As the creaking of the stairs echoed with each step, my breathing grew faster. I prayed that whoever was down there, most likely a burglar, wouldn't harm my dad. After about half an hour, my dad came back upstairs, his face pale as a sheet. When we asked him what had happened, he brushed it off, saying it was just a rat. But I knew he was lying. The next day, my mom gave in to my persistent questions and told me the truth. When my dad went downstairs, there was a man pacing back and forth in the middle of the living room. He was muttering to himself as he moved quickly. When my dad asked, "Are you okay?" the man suddenly stopped and turned his head toward him. My dad, stunned by what he saw, quickly turned back to turn on the lights, but when he returned to the living room, there was no one there. Still in shock from seeing the man without a face, my dad told us it was just a rat and confided the real story to my mom later. Shortly after my mom shared this with me, one of our neighbors came over and they started chatting. What I overheard terrified me even more. The woman asked if we'd heard about the accident that happened the night before. She explained that a young man had crashed on the road and died horribly after a tree branch pierced his skull. As the woman continued her animated story, my mom and I could only think of one thing: the faceless man who had visited our home the night before. In the 1880s, a chain of disasters began in southern Egypt with the discovery of the mummy of Amen-Ra by 4 young Englishmen. The curse first struck when one of the young men mysteriously disappeared. Soon after, another was shot and killed by his servant, who confessed afterward that he had done it against his will. The 2 remaining young men took the mummy back to England. One of them lost his wealth after the bank where he had invested his money went bankrupt, while the other contracted a fatal illness and squandered his entire fortune living on the streets. The cursed mummy of the princess eventually ended up in the hands of a businessman who donated it to the British Museum. But the strange events didn't stop there. Night guards at the museum claimed to hear crying sounds coming from the coffin and were too frightened to approach it. Before long, one of the guards was found dead inside the museum. Around the same time, a journalist who photographed the mummy took his own life by gunshot. Years later, the mummy was purchased by an American archaeologist and loaded onto the Titanic in 1912. As we all know, the unsinkable Titanic struck an iceberg and became the watery grave of hundreds of people. That tragic event was the last reported incident tied to the curse of Amen-Ra. A woman had spent the evening out late with her friends and got into a car to head home. Shortly after she started driving, she noticed a car following her. Trying to stay calm, she reassured herself that the driver might just be heading in the same direction. However, minutes passed and the car stayed directly behind her, matching her speed. Eventually, the car moved closer and started flashing its headlights repeatedly. Feeling increasingly frightened, the woman sped up, determined to reach her house and call the police. But the car behind her kept flashing its lights and seemed intent on chasing her. When she finally arrived at her home, she jumped out of her car and ran toward the house. As she did, she noticed the driver of the car behind her getting out and shouting something, though she couldn't make out the words. Panicking, she locked herself inside and immediately called the police. When the police arrived, the chilling truth came to light. The real danger hadn't been the car following her, but rather the person hiding in the back seat of her own car.